Here early, Fox News political analyst Reince Priebus, Fox News senior political analyst Juan Williams, and Meredith McGraw, White House reporter for The Wall Street Journal. Meredith, let me start with you. What did you hear from that? What struck you?
Well, I think we heard from the president that, again, that he feels like the mission here has been successful so far. They're ahead of schedule. But he did hear some pressing questions from the reporters there about his views on the potential new successor there in Iran, who he said he's disappointed by that pick. He talked about his phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin and claimed that Putin is going to be helpful. He mentioned also potential sanctions relief to ease up on oil prices. But I think there are still a lot of outstanding questions here about if Trump is disappointed in this new pick, well, what does that mean? Is this person going to be targeted? What is the president and the administration's involvement going to be moving forward? Iran, and what does this mean for the Iranian people?
Yeah, that perked my ears, the phone call with Vladimir Putin where he said he wants to be constructive. This comes after, a number of reports and confirmed by administration officials that Russia at one point was providing Iran targeting information of U.S. troops in the region. Reince, what else struck you?
Well, what struck me was the president putting out a very optimistic view. Now, he's optimistic generally, but he is someone who understands media and what the American people need to hear. And I think him talking about the fact that this could be complete now if we want it to be, he's balancing one of the most treacherous things any president could try to balance. He has a once-in-a-generation opportunity in the Middle East where Arab countries are aligned. He has an opportunity to change the entire course of history in the Middle East. But he's also balancing the uncertainty of war. He's balancing an anxious public. He's balancing gas prices. He's balancing the midterm. And he has to do all of that and I think really portray this optimism that I think he knows that the American people want to hear. And that's why he's delivering that.
Yeah, and listen, we come from a time of war where we saw George W. Bush say mission accomplished on a boat, and that didn't happen. So there is skepticism and some thought about rose-colored glasses from at least some segment, not just Democrats, but some Republicans, whether that's true or not. But clearly the president believes they're close to ending this.
Well, but that's why I think in the beginning of the press conference, he focused so much attention, and you see the Department of War doing it, Marco Rubio doing it. They are focusing on neutralizing Iran. The president is saying to his generals, why is any missile site still functioning? Why are drones being launched from here? Why aren't we nailing every single one of these pieces of military equipment? Because once that's done, well, then the president's got time to deal with the regime issue. And that's why all the focus is on that. And then he's got time to deal with that problem.
You know, Juan, he also said, well, first of all, he was asked by Aisha Hasni about sleeper cells and was there a message. He said they're tracking it all, but then he went political and said Democrats are shutting down DHS and causing a problem in our ability to deal with that. He also said that, next steps here, he put a template, much like Venezuela, which we talked about before, how you deal with somebody on the inside, like Delcy Rodriguez, to try to get the country to straighten out.
Right, and I think that's been his thought all along, that in fact, he could find somebody in there. Now, what we've heard in terms of the reports on the bombing damage was that not only was the Supreme Leader Khomeini killed, but that, in fact, some of the people that he had thought might be good replacements were killed.
Different tiers, yeah.
Yes. And, and currently we have Khomeini's son, whose family was killed. And
there's some reporting that he was injured and had to have his leg amputated. We're trying to get that confirmed. But
okay, well,
anyway.
but it doesn't signal that this guy is going to be any more open or less antagonistic towards us as Americans. I thought, to me, I'm accustomed to President Trump being rather, exuberant and convincing in his language. And I thought he was fairly muted in terms of his assessment of the state of what's going on. And I think that earlier today, he said in an interview that he felt like, we have got this largely done. And what he saw was the stock market then recovered. The stock market went up. And I think that's what he was trying to do in this press conference today was to signal to the investors as well as to people who are going to the gas pump, look, we've got this under, we got this under control. It's going to go away shortly. But the fact that he was so, I think reluctant to just kind of, say mission accomplished, as you said, Brett.
Well,
I think, right. No,
there's
I'm
history
not
there.
blaming you. What? Right. And I think that's why you say it's not just Democrats, but it's lots of people, Republicans. Everybody says, exactly, what did we accomplish here? You didn't get the regime change. Where is the enriched uranium that you were talking about? We don't know where that is at the moment. And gas prices have gone up. So I think there's a lot of concern. I think that the fact that he spoke in such sober terms reflects that.
Britt, the administration would say what was accomplished was taking out the ability of Iran to have a ballistic missile threat to its neighbors, diminishing or taking out the drone capability and factories, and setting back even further because they were starting back up a nuclear program that they took out in Midnight Hammer. He said at one point, this will be over when Iran has no capacity of weaponry against U.S., Israel, or our allies for a very long time. And you have allies like UAE that have taken the brunt of these hits, double what Israel has taken.
Yeah, and I think that Iran's calculus, to the extent it can be defined, is that, boy, we start hitting those people, they're going to tell the U.S. to knock it off. That hasn't happened. It hasn't come near to happening. In fact, it turned out to be strategic idiocy on the part of Iran to further alienate its neighbors who don't like Iran but tried to get along with it. And they were forced to choose, and it appears for now at least, and probably going forward, that they have chosen to join the United States and hope the United States can prevail and not to do anything to hinder that. So I think, the chances of what can be called a real victory here have risen, not diminished. And that I'm a little unclear by Juan. I love you, Juan, but I thought the president, if you listen to his words, was pretty darn exuberant. So that's where I come out on this anyway.
Well, Juan, go ahead.
No, I think I'm used to the president being exuberant. I didn't think he was exuberant, Britt. I thought that he was measured, and intentionally so, because I think he wants to control how the narrative goes from here, and in terms of saying, here are the measures of the success. So far, he's saying it's a military success. But obviously, the Iranian strategy is to prolong this thing and put the United States, and especially countries that depend on the oil coming through, in a treacherous state.
One would think, with 8 U.S. service members dead, that the tone would be fairly measured. Meredith, from here, there will be these questions. How many days? What's it look like? Those are things that they're not going to put a timeline on, but he's clearly signaling that there's a light at the end of this tunnel.
He is signaling, at least to the public, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think there are very serious political issues at play. We're talking about rising gas prices, the terrible deaths of our own U.S. servicemen, and real questions from the American people about how long this could go on. And those are all levels of tolerance that the president's going to have to weigh as he makes these decisions moving forward.
But there will be pressure from the other side, from the Israelis, to say don't stop. There will be pressure from the people who have waited for Iran to be this weak to say don't stop. We need to help the people on the ground get this regime out. And that's the balance, right?
Well, one of the things that I learned about working with President Trump, and still to this day, is that when he puts out there that I think that this situation is coming to a close or it could be ending soon, that's actually what Donald Trump wants. He doesn't hide his own feelings. His feelings to the public are very, very similar and almost exact to the feelings that he shares with his staff in the Oval Office.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.